Welcome in, Heart Talkers, to another episode of Heart Talk. I am your host, Laura Lawrence, and I'm so grateful that you continue to show up every week as I guide you through everyday conversations with everyday people through both the hard and hope-filled seasons of life. And my guest today, Martin Lockett, comes to us from the United States. We have not met in person. I heard him on another podcast. Very much enjoyed his story of resilience and hope and healing. Really great speaker. And so I invited him to join us today. And so welcome, Martin, to the Heart Talk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Laura. It's an absolute honor to be here with you today.
Yeah, that's what I find to be so, I think the most fulfilling part of this journey as a podcaster is I get to meet people who I would never have met through this journey. So you are an author, you're a public speaker, you are a DUI advocate, and you have one hell of a powerful story. And so we're going to get right into it. And I always start by asking my guests, to share who you really are with our Heart Talk community. So who is Martin Lockett?
Who is Martin Lockett? Martin Lockett is a twin. I am a substance abuse counselor by trade. I am a director at a mental health and substance abuse and suicide prevention organization out of Portland, Oregon, although I live in Pennsylvania. And I am, as you said, a staunch advocate for DUI and DWI prevention. So I speak around the country at panels and alcohol safety classes and conferences and high schools, especially before prom and graduation season comes, because we know a lot of kids tend to excuse drinking and driving during that period, and really just try to spread awareness and the irreversible consequences that can ensue from a DUI or DWI related crash.
Yeah, this topic hits close to home for me. I have a family member that passed away from a drinking and driving accident, and I
I'm
had a
so sorry.
student. Yeah, I mean, he was my mom's cousin, and so it was really little, but it impacted the family greatly. And then I think one of the most impactful moments in my life as an educator is when I lost one of my really great students to a drinking and driving accident when he was in grade 11. And so this is a very important conversation. I mean, all the listeners know that I'm an educator, I'm a mental health speaker to youth, and so I'm really happy that you're here today, just sharing your story. And so let's get right into it. So how your book is called From Pain, or the Pain to Purpose Pipeline, right?
Very close, very close. So Prison to Purpose Pipeline is the name of the memoir, but very close.
I did do my due diligence prior to hopping on it. It's mom brain, Martin. Okay,
I get it.
Prison to Purpose Pipeline. Okay, so wow. Let's start at the beginning. I mean, of how you got to writing that book.
So how I got to writing the book. So just for a little context, so I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in the 80s, and I know that folks are, kind of familiar with the Portland area because of the naked bike rides that we do every year, or the whole Keep Portland Weird mantra, or Portlandia that they've seen. I can just tell you it was vastly different back then. It was very much like a war zone. There were gangs coming up from California fighting for drug territory. It was the height of the crack epidemic. It was not a safe place to live. And so my parents really tried to do everything they could to shield my siblings and me from the utter chaos. And so we were very much involved in, Little League baseball and Pop Warner football and Cub Scouts and all these activities to kind of keep us from the streets. And that worked well until we got to high school. I was a very shy kid. And, when you're in high school, you can't find yourself by yourself, right? You have to have kids to hang out with. And so that meant that I kind of immediately gravitated to other kids who happened to live in my neighborhood, but I had never met. And we did all sorts of things we should not have been doing, such as skipping school and stealing cars and drinking alcohol. And I remember the first time that I drank alcohol when I was 14. I was at a party. I remember how much I loved it because it allowed me for the first time in my life to come out of my shell and open up and talk to people more freely, especially when it came to girls. And so it was like a miracle drug that enabled me to be the Martin that I always wanted to be. And so that was kind of my infatuation with alcohol for the first couple years, or for between 14 and 16. And then when 16 came, things took a more sinister turn because now I'm dealing with some really internal complex issues around race and identity and life opportunities, or the lack there or perceived the lack thereof, perceived opportunities. And so I use alcohol to cope with these feelings that I didn't know how to process. Certainly wasn't comfortable talking about in my household. Culturally, we just don't talk about certain things. And so alcohol was my numbing agent, and I was a full-blown alcoholic, I'll say, at 16. I would find myself drinking before I went to school. I would drink during my lunch breaks, and I would drink after school, certainly. And so, um, alcoholism was very much in control of my life as a teenager, and that takes us into the crash that ultimately led me to write the book Prison and Purpose Pipeline, as well as to become a staunch DUI advocate. And so I'll just kind of sum it up by saying that on New Year's Eve of 2003, I had drank all day, I partied all night with friends, and at 1:03 a.m., I sped through a red light and I crashed into a car and I killed two people and I severely injured a third person in that crash. And because of the laws in Oregon that are very strict around DUI manslaughter, I knew I was going to go to prison for roughly 20 years, day for day, no matter what. I knew that, and so that was the obviously the worst day of many people's lives, but it was also the beginning of a new pathway forward for me to discover purpose.
So, oh my gosh. As I listen to you tell this story of your lived experience, where it started as a youth, growing up where you grew up, having all of the layers and nuances to what it's like to be a teen, but also to be a teen of color, trying to find your identity. Um, I think about this. No, there's no such thing as a bad kid. There's no such thing as a bad kid, and no kid or no parent ever, envisions this type of path for themselves or their children. And so how old were you when this happened?
So I was 24 when the crash happened.
Okay, you were 24. And so take me through that moment of the crash, and then the days that ensued after.
Sure. So the when the crash happened, and so I'll tell you, I didn't know that two people had died initially. So I'm being interviewed by the officer at the scene. He could clearly see that and hear and smell that I was intoxicated. And I fully admitted everything and admitted that I shouldn't have been driving that night and things like that. One person had been ejected from the vehicle onto the pavement. They died on impact. And that's the first person that my brother saw. I didn't see them. My brother saw them. He was in a car with me, and he pointed out that somebody was lying on the pavement and that they were not moving. And so instantly it starts to dawn on me and starts to resonate, um, the magnitude of what I had just done. Right, I know that this is bad. Like, this is really bad. So within seconds, the first responders are there. They're attending to the victims. The officer's talking to me, and he confirmed about 5 minutes into that interview, he confirmed that this person who was on the pavement had in fact been pronounced dead. And so he told me that another person was being transported to the hospital just blocks away. So I'm placed on arrest. I'm put into the back of the patrol car. We head for downtown for processing. And from the back seat, I'm listening to the police radio because there's a lot of chatter about the crash, as you can imagine. And about 10 minutes into that ride downtown, I could hear it come over the police radio that unbeknownst to me, completely unbeknownst to me, there was another passenger who had actually been pronounced dead at the scene as well. So there were two people who had died. And in my 24-year-old brain, as devastated as I am about that, I am very much calculating what that means for my life
Mhm.
because I know that the mandatory minimum law in Oregon requires 10 years for a DUI manslaughter. And now I've got two of them. So I'm kind of mentally going through this in my head. Um, for the next several days, as I'm processing everything, um, I hadn't heard much about the victims. I did see I watched the news and saw it was on the news, and they just reported, the facts. They didn't release names or anything like that. And about 4 days later, I'm in my cell and just minding my own business, and I noticed that someone had slid the statewide newspaper. They slid it underneath my door, and I was confused because I didn't ask anybody to see a paper. But I figured there must be something important in there for me to read. So I pick it up, I start to thumb through this paper, and I see my picture, my mugshot, on the front page of one of the sections. And I start to read this article. And for the first time in like 4 days now, my unknown victims became people, right? And these people had an incredible story. And what I learned in that article was that the two people who died were in long-term recovery. One had 16 years, one had 17 years in recovery at the time. They had devoted their lives to help other people get clean and sober. So, for instance, they would watch women's children so that ladies could attend AA and NA meetings. They were volunteers with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, no less. They were staunch advocates in the Portland recovery community for helping people overcome addiction. And the night that this happened, they were actually returning home from celebrating at a clean and sober New Year's Eve party when they were struck and killed by a drunk driver. And so the columnist had talked about the palpable irony that these people who had given their lives to help other people get clean and sober would have theirs cut short by a drunk driver, the very person they would have given anything to help. And then he said something at the end of the article, Laura, that completely, I mean, set my path from that day forward and guides my work even today, now 20 years later. He said, perhaps the person they will have ended up helping the most is the man who's charged with killing them. And that's the way he ended the article. And it was such a profound statement. Now, I couldn't fully make sense of it at the time because, again, I'm 24 years old and I'm trying to wrap my brain around the fact that I'm going to go to prison for about 20 years. I'll be in my 40s likely when I get out. So it was difficult to see how this utter tragedy was going to actually help me in some way. But it was also a statement like that I had to find out how those words were supposed to be applied to my life. I couldn't ignore it. So I kind of went into my spirituality and I started to pray about it and I meditated on the phrase. I would hear it ring throughout my head during the day. And about 5 or 6 months later, it finally dawned on me that the only way this tragedy will not be in vain is if I carry on these people's legacies and if I devote every ounce of my being into this cause of helping people um, to combat and overcome addiction, starting with myself, right, to understand why I went the way that I did. Nobody in my family was, even big drinkers, right, let alone an alcoholic. And so, but to do everything I could to carry on the wonderful work they were doing in the recovery community. So in that moment, I vowed to do that. I had no idea how that would take shape. I didn't even know at that point how long I was going to be in prison for sure. I just knew it was going to be, at least, 15 years. I knew that. Um, but I was devoted to the cause. However that would look, I was all in. So that was when I mentally shifted and just seeing me going to prison as just an utter loss of life and just this
Mhm.
horrific thing. And obviously it's not something you would want to have, but it shifted me away from just looking at the negative and starting to understand that I can actually make something of this for my life and then for the greater good of humanity. So that was that was when things changed for me.
Wow. I am feeling a ton of emotion as I listen to you. And we always feel emotion in our bodies. That's how it shows up. And I'm I'm thinking we always have a choice, right? And in that moment, you could have chosen to feel sorry for yourself, pity, focus on the, dismal, aspect of I'm in jail for the next 15 years at least, but you took that as an opportunity to rehabilitate, which not everyone who's incarcerated does. So do you feel like that was a divine moment, that article, whoever slipped that under, that reporter? Have you met that reporter? Did you meet?
So first of all, it was absolutely divine. There's no
Mhm,
question about it. I was meant to read that article that day, written by that person in that moment. Like
mhm,
everything was orchestrated, I have no doubt. I did not meet the reporter. What I did was about 15 years later, so as I'm kind of getting close to the end of my sentence, I reached out. I wrote a letter to the writer of the article. He's actually no longer at the Oregonian, which I mean, makes sense. People retire and move on. The person who had filled his shoes, however, was so taken by the letter and what had all transpired, that she got on my visitors list. She came into the prison. She interviewed me, and then she later published an article just highlighting how this all started all these years ago, and now this is what this guy has done in the wake of this tragedy, to honor his victims. So I actually ended up writing three articles for the Oregonian, highlighting different aspects of the journey. And then I've actually written one and had it published since I've been out, highlighting the difficulty that guys or folks in general who have done extensive amount of time in prison, the difficulty they have in being able to like rent apartments, because they just don't have that rental history. And so I kind of propose some policy changes that could make it easier for folks, to get housing when they get out. But yeah, so that's kind of how that culminated.
So did you ever get the opportunity to meet the families of the two individuals who died?
So, meat, I wouldn't say meat. They were at the sentencing, obviously. They gave victim impact statements, very, very profound, beautiful victim impact statements. They were actually very forgiving of me. Um, One had expressed that, she felt sorry for my family because I was going to go away for a really long time, and she knew that they were going to miss me, and she encouraged me to hug my mom every chance that I got, because you never know when it could be the last time you hug your mom. Um, another one said that if she was prepared to ask the judge to, to ask to give me a more lenient sentence because I took responsibility and I was
Mhm.
remorseful and responsible and all those things. So they were really, really forgiving. Um, I didn't hear from anybody on that side of the family for the next 16 years. So 16 years into my sentence. So we're talking at the height of at the outset of the pandemic. So March of 2020, when the world shut down, I get a letter underneath my door, and I am like, I'm nervous as all get out because I see the name on this envelope, and I don't know this person, but I certainly know the last name, right? And so I open this letter, and it's three short paragraphs. And she says, "Hi, my name is such and such. My mom was such and such." And then she immediately starts to go into expressing concern for me and everybody else who was incarcerated during that really tough period. And she
Mhm.
was saying how, if there's any way she can send me food or toilet paper or money or anything um, to help me out during that time, that she would be more than happy to do. She never once said how difficult it had been for her and her family over the last 16 years, without their mother. She didn't go on, you know, an angry rant about how much she hates me because I did this. Like, and she would have been justified, right? She had every
Mhm.
right to express whatever she wanted to express. Instead, she was only concerned about my well-being. And so I sat with that letter for a few days because, as you can imagine, like I didn't expect that. So I processed that, and then I wrote her back like 12 pages, front and back. And because it was important for me to outline to her everything that I had done over the last 16 years to honor my commitment that I made in that courtroom all those years ago. So she would know that I wasn't just saying words that sounded good for the cameras or the judge or even her family, frankly, but that this is who I am and this is what I will forever be. And this is the work that I am committing myself to for the rest of my natural life. And so she wrote me back and she thanked me for that. And she said this is the best possible outcome that my family and I could
Mm.
have hoped for. She said, I'm going to share this with them. And she just encouraged me to continue on this path. So we exchanged 2 or 3 letters at that time. I haven't heard from her since then. I haven't heard from anybody in the family since I've been out. I've been out for a little over 3 years now. And I may never hear from them again. However, I believe that that moment and that exchange was, again, a divine thing. I didn't know that I needed validation from her necessarily because I felt that the work that I had done to make amends and that I will forever do to make amends was enough for me to forgive myself and to be okay with
Mhm.
myself. However, when she told me that that's the best possible outcome that she and her family could have hoped for, like that did validate a
Yeah.
lot for me. And it gave me something I didn't know I needed, but I'm so eternally grateful for hearing those words from her, and for her sharing that with me. And so I feel like that was meant to be. And if I never hear from them again, then that's also meant to be.
Yeah, and this story gives us insight to like hope for humanity, and that if we stay anchored in love and forgiveness, healing and hope comes right after it because they could have too, had two choices of how to move forward in this with resentment, with anger, which really just eats us up inside. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's ironic to say what a beautiful story, because it's steeped in so much pain and loss, not just for the family, but for you, for your family. I mean, I just really, when I'm listening to you, it's interesting. I immediately go to the lens of a mother. And I envision being a mother in this situation and having my son make one bad choice. Um, and that changes the trajectory of his entire life.
Yeah, and my mom, I mean, I was always a mama's boy growing up. I was very, very close to my mother. My twin brother was very close to our father. And so I remember when I was 15, 16 years old, even though I was struggling with these internal issues, I would sit and have coffee with my mom and talk about, her stuff, right? She felt comfortable confiding in me. There were some issues within the marriage, and she would confide in her 16-year-old son more so than she would, my 18-year-old sister, right?
Mm.
We were just that close. And so when this happened, obviously she was absolutely devastated. She was crushed, as was my dad. And but my family, we've always been extremely supportive of one another. So my family was with me through that. I will say that we did lose our mother about 3 years into my sentence. My mom
Mm.
was always ill. She had diabetes and lupus and congestive heart failure. It's like she could never work, so dad took care of the family financially. My mom died at 51 years of age. Um, and how I was able to kind of see her off, if you will, they allowed me. Well, my family paid for me to go. I could visit the funeral home. I couldn't attend the funeral because it's too risky, right?
Mm.
So I'm escorted by 2 armed corrections officers. We take a trip because I'm about 3.5 hours at a prison out in rural Oregon. So they transport me back to Portland, to the funeral home, and the only person who's allowed to be there is the funeral director. And so we park and they actually go in. One officer gets out and goes into the funeral home to sweep the place to make sure that none of my friends or family are hiding out with guns looking to, snatch me. So then we go in, they let me sign the book. I'm shackled at the wrists, I'm shackled at the ankles, I'm wearing a white jumpsuit. Um, and so they escort me in, and we go into the room where my mom is, and she's fully, makeup and clothed, and she's in the casket and everything. And the officers go to the back of the room, and I spend about 10 minutes with my mom, and um, it's a very cold, um, it's just a cold environment, right? I'm there
Mm.
by myself with two armed officers, and that's the way I say goodbye to my mom for the final time. No hugs from family, no tears with family, no sitting and holding, like none of that. And then 13 months later, I did it for my dad, who unexpectedly passed, and made the same trip to the same funeral home. And so you don't think about any of these things when you're out there drinking and partying and living your
Mhm.
best life and being young, and you don't think about the consequences, right? Because I never thought that that was the way that I was going to see my mom and dad leave this earth. And the last place they saw me and got to hug me was in a prison visiting room. And so these are some of the messages I give to kids, when I'm talking to them about drinking and driving and partying and doing this and doing that. You have to consider what your choice, the consequences of your actions, and these are things you can never go back and change, right? That will forever be the last time I saw my mom and dad. And it's just something you don't want to have to live with.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that that was the fate of how that would play out for you. And I'm so sorry that the inhumane way that you were allowed to send off your mother and father. Um, it's just so hard to wrap our minds around the emotional aspect of this. Like, how are you, because now you're 27, right? How are you mind muscling your way through a sentence that is what was your sentence at 17 years?
17 and a half years. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you mind muscle your way through that? How do you get through 17 years of incarceration?
Yeah. So again, that kind of radical acceptance, as they say in DBT, like it had to start with that. Like I had to accept, and it really did change for me, Lord, once I accepted that this was going to be my fate. No matter what, I was going to be in prison for 17 and a half years. I get to decide how that 17 and a half years is going to look, right?
Mhm.
Um, so once I had committed myself to this cause, I take the plea bargain. I took a plea bargain for 17 and a half years because it could have been a lot more, frankly, had I gone to trial and lost the trial and gotten the maximum amount of time, which would have been 28 and a half years. So I take the 17 and a half, I get the state prison, and I figured the easiest way to honor their lives and their legacies is to become a substance abuse counselor. So I knew I needed a formal education. At that point, all I had was a GED. And so I figured, well, let me try to enroll in some college courses. So I do that at the prison. They were offering, you could take one college course per term, and they would charge us like $25. It was through a nonprofit that had raised money to pay for people who are incarcerated education, but you could only take one class at a time. So I did that for the first couple years, and that gave me a sense of direction and purpose. And then I'm working as a GED tutor. So I'm helping guys get their GEDs, working with guys one on one, guys with learning disabilities and special needs and things like that, who had never had success in a school setting. Um, and I'm helping them to get their GEDs. And I'm telling you, like at the graduations, and their parents would come. It's their first accomplishment they've ever had in life. Some guys are 45 years old,
Wow.
right? And they are in tears, and their families are just overjoyed, and I get to celebrate those moments with them. And so that gave me a sense of purpose and a pride, that allowed me to, for the first time in my life, to feel good about who I was and the difference
Yeah.
that I was making. And so I've kind of got these two tracks going where I'm pouring myself into guys, and I'm getting my education and giving myself a sense of direction. And then when I tragically lost my father, um, about 4 years into my sentence, because he had worked his whole life to make sure that we would have something when he wasn't here. I used some of that money, his life insurance policies and his pension, and I financed my education. I started taking classes from major universities, Louisiana State University and Indiana University, and I got my bachelor's degree in sociology from Colorado State University a few years later, and then I went on to get a master's degree in psychology. A couple years later, in 2016, I got that, and then I enrolled into a substance abuse treatment program in the prison setting, and that was the first time that I'd actually gone through an intensive treatment program, where I was really able to really start to peel back the layers of
Mm.
my addiction and why it started, when it started, why it started the way that it did, and why it progressed the way that it did, and why my mentality was the way that it was, and just really understood a lot of the nuances of that. And so that was really revelatory for me. I joined AA, started doing AA every week. I had a robust workout,
Mm.
plan or regimen, and self-care routine that I was strictly dedicated to. And I felt alive and I felt free for the first time. And I finally had a healthy identity and a sense of self and a sense of purpose and meaning in my life. And then but I was still focused on the goal, and the goal was to become a substance abuse counselor. So even though I had a master's degree, I knew I still needed the clinical hours to get certified. So
Mm.
when I completed the program, the substance abuse treatment program, I went to my director, of my clinical supervisor, and I asked him if I could work as a as a mentor in the program under his supervision to get those clinical hours. And this was a program that was not a part of the Department of Corrections. There's HIPAA laws, and having
Mhm.
access to people's files, like you just can't do that, right?
Right.
However, he saw how dedicated I was to this. I told him how much money I had poured into my education, my father's hard-earned money. He knew I was fully dedicated to this. So he went to his boss, an administrator in the Department of Corrections. And long story short, they cut a bunch of red tape. They allowed me to become a mentor in the program. I was started to do assessments for guys coming into the program. I did orientations. I would lead the group twice a week. I would do one-on-ones. So I'm getting all the clinical experience needed.
Mm.
And so I accrued enough hours to then take the test and get state certified as a substance abuse counselor 2.5 years before I got out of prison. And so again, Laura, having these goals, and this is how I know it was divine, because stuff like this just doesn't happen, right? Those
Yeah.
opportunities like that just don't happen. So I knew from the beginning, from the moment I read that article to, 17 years later, and everything that had transpired along the way, where I had written a couple books and got them published while I was inside, got a master's degree while I was inside, got state certified as a recovery mentor first, and then as a substance abuse counselor, all while inside, and started had the opportunity for the first time to tell my story at a DUI victim impact panel within the prison setting. It just so happened when I got transferred to the second prison, I did three. I was at three prisons throughout the entire 17 and a half years. The second prison that I got transferred to, where I did this treatment program and I got the hours for to become a counselor, they also had just started having a DUI victim impact panel in the prison setting, where they were bringing in somebody from the community who had lost a loved one to a DUI driver. And then, so they would tell their heart wrenching story. And then one of us on the inside would tell our story as to how we were there for that exact same crime. And it would be about 50 inmates in a circle, having this panel. And that was the first time I had told my story. And so it gave me an opportunity to start to kind of craft it, and to to perfect it really in the
Mm.
way that I wanted it to be told. And I did that for several years. So then when I got out in 2021, I had already started to make some connections in the communities so I can get out and start speaking at DUI victim impact panels. And so then that has now translated into speaking across the country at conferences and panels and classes and colleges and high schools and you name it. So again, everything that happened along the way during my incarceration was all toward this purpose and this cause that I had dedicated myself to all those years prior. And so that's why, I know it is divine, it was purposeful. It, and for a while I questioned, like I just hated the fact that two beautiful people had to lose their lives for me to get on this path and for me to finally figure out my purpose. But I also don't question divinity and why things happen the way they do. I just
Hmm.
accept that this is what happened, and this is what I am meant to be doing. And I hope that wherever they are, they can um, you know um, uh, have a smile in their heart, knowing that I am doing everything I can to honor what they stood for and how they lived their lives.
Absolutely. What stood out to me there when you were sharing this is that on this journey, when you're finding this purpose and you're educating yourself and you're advocating for yourself that you can finish your degree and get all those hours done, as you said, I felt free.
Hmm.
And the irony in that of, coming from a man who's incarcerated for 17 and a half years, lost his mom, lost his dad, took the lives of two people, and you say, I felt free because you were finally able to really dig in, go through those layers, find that identity and that purpose. Yeah, what a ultimate pivot story.
Yeah, no, you're right in the because I wasn't, even though I was physically free when I was a teenager and a young man before this all happened, um, I was in bondage. I was in bondage to alcohol. I was in bondage to crippling insecurities that I had. I was in
Mhm.
bondage to just a lack of identity and a healthy self-concept, right? Like none of those, I had none of those things. And so I was a slave to alcohol is what
Mhm.
resulted from that. So the fact that I was finally firmly rooted in a healthy identity that I knew was also making a difference to other people. And this is a valuable lesson I learned throughout this process, Laura, that enabled me to be free. Is that when I was out in the world and I'm in my addiction and I'm very superficial because I'm insecure. So I have to have the nice clothes and I have to have the nice car and I have
Mhm.
to project to the world that I'm somebody, right? That I'm important, right? All these superficial things. And so the joy, if you will, that I got in that was very fleeting and was not sustained, right? Because it's not real. And so what I learned was when I got into this work and I'm giving up myself to other people, right? I'm pouring myself into other people. So essentially I'm giving away everything that I've learned. I've got this experience, life experience and education, and I'm giving it away and I'm pouring it into other people. That in turn filled me up with
Mhm.
validation and a sense of self-worth and a sense of purpose and allowed me to feel good about myself. And it's a total opposite of what I was doing before, where I was saying, let me get everything I can get. Let me get all the money. Let me get the
Yeah.
clothes. Let me get the women. Let me get the car. Let me get the stuff. Right. And that'll make me feel good. No, it's giving away what you have and sharing it with humanity and pouring yourself into other people is what in turn, fills me up with validation and joy and purpose and meaning. And so just understanding that that's the way it works. I think naturally as human, and this is something I learned in the psychosocial development framework that I learned I was doing all my psychology classes. That we all reach a point. I think it's the fifth stage. They say we go through 8 stages of psychosocial development, and the fifth one is generativity versus stagnation. And we
Mhm.
reached that point when we're about, I want to say 30 years old, he says, Eric Erickson. And basically, we reach a point where we go beyond ourselves and we look to give back to, he says, the younger generations, right? It's a natural part of human psychosocial development. But that is versus stagnation, where you feel stagnant in life, right?
Mhm.
If you're stuck in this phase of just trying to accumulate everything you can to show the world how great you are, right? Internally, you don't feel fully satisfied
Yeah.
because that is not a natural human progression, of life, right? You have to find a way to give back to those coming behind you. And so, in terms of addiction, um, it's not necessarily about the younger generation. I mean, it is, but it's not strictly about that. It's about anybody struggling in active addiction. Those are my people. that's who I'm supposed to give back to. That's where my focus ought to be. And so, again, I feel free. I'm finally Martin, the Martin that was, I was meant to be living this life and doing this work. And like life couldn't be greater.
Oh, I cannot wait to share this episode with some of our youth following over with Youth Matter Canada. I think it is just going to be so powerfully impactful for them. And like you said, anyone who is struggling, who is in that active addiction and struggling to find their identity and you know, with hopes that this story can help give them hope and some healing. So let's talk a little bit about how it was when you finally finish the sentence and then you have to assimilate back into the world.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, a lot changed from 2004 to 2021,
Hmm.
namely technology.
Yeah.
So it was quite, and I've been out a little over 3 years now, and there's still very, very challenging moments for me. So it was a very slow, methodical process.
Yeah.
So for like the first 3 weeks, I would make so my days would look like I would like kind of take care of like responsibilities like going to see my parole officer, going to the DMV to get an ID, and going shopping for new clothes, and getting my email set. I never had an email right before I went to
Mm.
prison, so just all these. So I would spend the first half of the day kind of doing those things. And then the latter half of the day, I would spend with family and friends and go out to dinner and just kind of have a relaxing time. But for like the first 3 to 4 weeks, just because there was so much information coming at me, like I was so mentally and emotionally drained
Yeah.
by and felt physically drained, right? And I hadn't like gone on any jogs or walks or lifted any weights during that time. But because there's so much stimuli, so when you're in prison, at least the prison I was at, the prisons I was in, rather, um, everything is drab, right? The walls are gray, the officers' uniforms are gray or black. We wear dark blue. There's not a lot of light and colors, and so even going to like the grocery store, and there's bright colors and advertisements and little kids running around, and there's all
Mm.
these choices, right, going down aisles, and all these choices of all, and like it was even just like taking that in was a lot. Like it
I
was a
bet.
lot. Even hearing a little baby cry in the store, I remember for the first time. And most people would hear a baby cry and the baby's just going off, and people were looking for the parent to get the baby to be quiet. And for me, it was such a welcoming sound, because it was a sound that I hadn't heard for almost 2 decades. And I was like, wow, that's what a baby sounds like to cry. I remember that sound. And so the way that other people were probably internalizing that was much different than the way that I was internalizing it.
Yeah.
But it was just all these small things that people take for granted every single day. And I was just relishing. And even today, Laura, I promise you, when I wake up out of my bed and I go downstairs and I make myself a cup of coffee and I sit on my couch and I watch my TV, and like just the freedom to do those things, like I would never, like I'm so appreciative for them. And I never want to lose sight of that. I never want to get complacent and start to take things for granted out here, because I know
Hmm.
what it felt like to not have those simple freedoms for almost 2 decades. And so it's given me a whole new perspective on life. So I adapted um, over the course of a few months. So I waited 4 months to start working a job just to give myself time to acclimate, and I still had money from my dad's, estate. So I wasn't, desperately needing to start working, thankfully, right away. So when I started working, I got a job as a call counselor because
Mm.
I had the certification. So I was taking calls um, uh, uh, remotely, which was great because I can't drive until 2029 because of this crash. I can't get a driver's license. So working remotely was going to be the best thing for me, and I was able to secure a job working remotely. And so I did that for 2 years. Meanwhile, I also started traveling and telling my story and things like that. So that was really picking up, and generating more income, on the side. Um, and so I did the call counseling for a couple years, and then about a year ago, actually a year ago, just couple of days ago on the 5th was when I got promoted to director at this mental health, substance abuse, suicide prevention organization. And so now, because I live in Pennsylvania, I now travel to Oregon every month. I'll be going there on Wednesday, actually. I travel to Oregon every month to my Portland community. I'm there for a week to 10 days, and I lead a small team into communities of color to have conversations and do workshops and trainings around mental health and substance abuse and suicide prevention. I love my job. I now go back into the prisons as well. We started going back into the prison in May because when I got promoted to director, I told my CEO my top priority is to get us back to get us into prisons to do
Hmm.
this work. He was fully on board with it. Several months later, we worked out a contract with the Department of Corrections, and now I go into the prisons and do mental health first aid trainings with the adults in custody who are looking to get into this work as well. And they are peer mentors, helping their fellow inmates who are struggling with mental health challenges. And so again, it is so rewarding for me. And when I go in, they always tell me, they say, as great as this training is, we need this training. We love it, but it's even more important that you're the one doing it because you've been where we've been. And to
Hmm.
see you come in here wearing your suit, wearing your tie, looking sharp, being a professional, it lets us know that we can also get out and do the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it gives them hope and inspiration and motivation. And so it's come full circle. And again, life is, I travel. I'm going to Africa next month. I am going to the Bahamas the following month. I've been to many states. I've taken cruises. Again, Laura, I live such a blessed life, and this time, I am, soaking up every minute of it and not taking any second of it for granted.
Yeah, what a full circle story, Martin. And listening to you tell it on another person's podcast versus sitting here heart to heart, face to face, and being the one, to ask the questions and hear the story through my ears this time has been a profound experience for me, for sure. And so I want to end with asking you, if there's any youth listening to this podcast or anyone who's struggling right now with mental health and addictions, what do you want to leave them with?
I would just say that, especially for young people, you are not alone. There are many countless people who have gone through things that you are going through, even though you often feel that nobody's going to understand. I'm telling you, people understand, and I am telling you that people are there to help, but you have to let them know that you need help. And I know it's not an easy thing. It wasn't for me. I wish I would have reached out and been more vocal about the ways I was struggling because I'm telling you, there are responsible, amazing adults around you, whether it be in your home or in your church or in your school or wherever that will help you. You don't have to fight this battle alone, and you shouldn't, because it can become too much for any of us. And
Hmm.
so, just if you don't feel well, even if you don't know what's behind it, you don't have to understand it. If you don't feel well, and I encourage you to reach out and let somebody know that you don't feel well and seek the help that is there. And for those who might be a little older and struggling with addiction, it is never too late. It is never too late to make the choice to say, I want more for my life. Even if you don't believe that you can change or that things are going to get better, I am telling you, there's adequate help available. I encourage you to reach out to me. I can connect you with some awesome resources wherever you live. Um, because we all deserve to live happily and healthily and in a wholesome way. And so we owe that to ourselves. And so I encourage you to reach out if you are struggling and know that there is help available.
Absolutely. It is part and parcel of the human experience to struggle. Every one of us will struggle, but we're not meant to struggle in silence or to struggle alone. So
That's right.
thank you for sitting heart to heart with me today. I do hope our paths cross again. I'm just already thinking how we can fly up here to Canada for our next youth symposium and get you talking to these kids. It's definitely one of the topics we haven't tackled yet as a keynote, DUI and drinking and driving. And so I look forward to staying connected. Thank you so much, Martin. Where can everybody find you?
Yeah, so I'm only on one social media platform, which is Instagram. You can find me at Martin underscore recovering alcoholic. There's also my website, martinlockett.com. And so again, Lord, this was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the incredible work that you're doing and your advocacy and reaching kids where they are. And it was a real honor to be with you today.
Thank you. I'm going to link everything in the show notes. And just know that your story has inspired me and has really left an imprint. So thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you.